Well, we are going to observe the Lord's table in a little bit, but I want to make a few remarks about the passage that Terry just read for us just a moment ago. There are two important things I want to point out from the reading up front. One was in Luke 24, where it says, when Jesus was at the table with them, these two disciples who had walked with him from Jerusalem to a little village called Emmaus, 7 miles away. It says Jesus took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. And then at the end of what Terry read, it says, then the two disciples from Emmaus told the 11 disciples in Jerusalem what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of bread. In both texts, Jesus is made known to them or is recognized as he broke bread. I want to talk to you today about recognizing Jesus. Jesus enjoyed table fellowship. He enjoyed good food, good wine, and the company of all kinds of people. I took the time this past week to notice that in the Gospel of Luke, there are 10 different meals that Jesus took part in. Sometimes he was a guest, sometimes he was a host, sometimes he was critical, and sometimes he was positive when he was at table. But he used on 10 different occasions a meal. One of the most common things we human beings do every day is to eat. Jesus used occasions when he was dining with others to teach important spiritual truths. To the extent that when we read this narrative today, we notice that two of Jesus' disciples, who as we'll see, didn't recognize who he was at first, had an aha moment when it came time for him to break bread and give it to them. I want to talk about that today. Let's rehearse the story just a moment so we can appreciate what is being said here and perhaps what the author of this story is doing. I mentioned that last part, what the author is doing, because you know we have 4 Gospels. This is the only place this particular story is found. If you were to read Matthew's Gospel, you would think there was no time for this story, because after Jesus' resurrection in Matthew's Gospel, the disciples are told to go immediately to Galilee, and that's where they would see Jesus. But in Luke's version of the story, the encounters that people have with Jesus all are associated with Jerusalem. There's no instruction whatsoever to go to Galilee. They were to stay in Jerusalem, which brings me to the question, what was the author trying to do by the way he told this story that's found nowhere else in the gospel records? Let's look at the story that we have in front of us. On the day when Jesus' tomb was found empty, 2 disciples are joined by the resurrected Jesus on the 7-mile journey to their village called Emmaus. We're told they do not recognize Jesus. This is not the only time this occurs. But here, they've said they don't recognize him. That sounds very strange to us. It sounds less strange to the ancient Greek and Roman world because it was not uncommon for divine men to take on the form of another, to disguise themselves with human encounters. So perhaps the author took the liberty to tell the story in this way, knowing that his audience would not find this terribly unbelievable. To us, it raises all sorts of questions. But either way, follow me along with the narrative, and I think maybe we can come to the conclusion of why this story is told the way it is later on. We're told that Jesus joins these 2. One of them's named Cleopas, the other is unnamed. 2 disciples who have been in Jerusalem, and they're walking the 7-mile trip to their village in Emmaus. 7 miles. Now, I keep track of my steps each day. I've already walked 5.74 miles. So I wouldn't even have made it to Emmaus yet. And you'll notice they go back to Jerusalem. So they got 14 miles. I don't know how many steps that would have been, but they got 14 miles all in one day. But on the journey to Emmaus, Jesus joins them, and notice that they're discussing, apparently with great passion, a subject among themselves, and Jesus kind of inquires what the topic is, and then they kind of give a rehearsal. He says, you must not be from around here, I'm paraphrasing. You must not be around here. You'd surely know about the fact that our leaders crucified Jesus, whom we believed was Messiah, was the hope of the redemption of Israel. But he was instead crucified by the religious establishment. But we had just heard from some women that his tomb was empty and that they had received a message from an angel that he was alive. And then Jesus, without identifying himself, begins to take them through the Hebrew Scriptures, the law and the prophets, teaching about, it says, all the things concerning himself without revealing his identity. Notice there's a sense of drama in the narrative. As a matter of fact, he remains hidden from their understanding until they reach their home in Emmaus. And as in keeping with good ancient hospitality customs, they invited Jesus in. They insisted that Jesus come in and stay with them for the night. So they gather around the table. And as they begin to enjoy the meal, we're told that Jesus took bread and he broke the bread and he gave it to them. And at that moment, they had an aha experience. They realized that indeed it was Jesus speaking with them who had traveled with him on the trip from Jerusalem to Emmaus. And then it says, he vanished from their sight. Now, again, that's an extraordinary story, found nowhere else in the Bible, nowhere else in the gospel. It sounds, well, it raises so many questions that for us of our modern minds, we just can't get the answers to. But the way the story is told is to make the point that it was not until the moment when Jesus broke bread that they realized who it was. Now, why is it told that way? Well, I'll get more to that later, but let me give you a glimpse. Jesus had a custom, as you've heard me say, of breaking bread with others. Remember, in Luke's gospel, he broke bread and fed 5,000 people with 12 baskets of bread and fish left over. Remember the story? He broke bread after he had blessed it. Also, we know that when just before he went to the Garden of Gethsemane, where he was arrested and later tried and then crucified, we're told that he took bread and he broke it and he gave it to his disciples and told them, this bread is my body, which will be broken for you. Right? So in the act of breaking bread, that moment was the moment they realized it was Jesus present among them, present with them after his resurrection. So what do these two do? It says within the hour, they immediately get up and make presumably the foot journey back to Jerusalem, another 7 miles, and they reach to where the 11 were staying, presumably still in the upper room, and the 11 are already spreading the word that Jesus is alive, that he's been seen alive. And then they relate their story. And they relate their story in this way. They said that we did not realize who he was until he broke bread. Now, why is this story told the way it's told? It's hard for me to believe that this should be read as a historical reality, and I'll tell you why. If you do, you have a big problem with Matthew's gospel. If you read it historically, you have a big problem with Mark's gospel. If you read this story literal, you have some problem with John's gospel. So what was the author trying to do here? Well, if you read throughout Luke and Acts, and they both really should be read together as one continuous narrative, you'll realize that this phrase, breaking bread, became associated with the Lord's Supper, with the communion. And each week when the believers would gather together as a community, what would they do? Well, they would teach the Scriptures in light of their understanding of Jesus. They would pray together. They would often sing together. And then they would break bread. Some traditions still insist upon a weekly breaking of bread. Yesterday we were here at the church, and the Church of Christ congregation had some people out distributing literature because they're having what they call a gospel meeting that's upcoming. If you're familiar with the churches of Christ, you're familiar with their gospel meetings, and they were trying to promote the church of Christ. And if you know, the churches of Christ, as well as the disciples of Christ, and to some extent the Catholic Church with Mass, they observe the Mass or the communion, the Lord's Supper, every week, reminiscent of the practice of the early church of observing the Lord's table each week when they gathered together. To do what? To break bread and share in the common cup, with the belief that when they did so, in some powerful way, Jesus was manifesting his presence spiritually among them. And that became a central idea in the early Christian movement. That when believers gathered together to commemorate the breaking of bread and the sharing of the cup, that they were welcoming, reaffirming that the presence of Christ continued to be in their midst. And so I believe the reason that the author of this gospel told the story in the way he did was to say we should continue to have an aha moment every time we gather for communion, for the Lord's Supper. When we break bread, when we share the common cup, the most important guest of all is there by faith. The belief that Jesus spiritually reappears within our midst to remind us that we are to be the ongoing presence of Christ in the world through his Spirit. So what do we read here in this story? One of the important principles, of course, for those of us who are people of faith, is that we should spend more time recognizing that Jesus is among us, spiritually speaking, recognizing his presence, realizing that Christianity is not some dry husk of a religion, but is intended to be a more vibrant, vital experience of the presence of God in Christ, where we in turn go out into the world and we convey that presence through our lives in the way we deal with others. I like to remind myself, just as we internalize a small piece of bread and a small amount of the fruit of the vine, the juice, just as we internalize it into our bodies, it becomes a part of us, a part of who we are. Just like food and its nutrients become a part of our life-giving survival, a way for us to continue our lives. Likewise, when we recognize the presence of Christ and we welcome his Spirit into our lives through the observance of the Lord's table, we're reminding ourselves also of this mysterious, mystical, continued presence of Jesus in our lives, so that when we go out into the world, we continue to represent him really. If Jesus is to be known in the world, he will have to be known through his people. And I looked at Christian history, and far too often we have failed to recognize Jesus. You remember there's a story later on in the book of Acts where we're told that because the disciples had gone out and performed a healing and had been teaching the way of Jesus, that they were arrested by the authorities. And when they came before the authorities, they boldly stood up for Jesus and their conviction that he was the Christ. And you remember what they said about them in the Sanhedrin? It says in the book of Acts, they took note that these men, and there were men in this case, that these men had been with Jesus. What does that mean? Certainly it had a literal meaning that they had been with Jesus as his disciples, following him across the Galilean hills and the countryside, ultimately in Jerusalem where he was crucified. But it also has a powerful metaphorical notion beyond the spiritual, the physical notion, and that they had been with Jesus because they were acting like him. They reminded people of the way he talked about God and cared for other people. When we come together to observe the Lord's table, it's a reminder to us that Christ's continued presence is in our lives. And the best charge that could ever be made against us is to say, you know, you remind me of what I imagine Jesus would be like. If we could all have to plead guilty to that charge, we would truly understand what it means to be a Christian.